Hello, and welcome everyone to today's webinar, Tackling the Complexity of Orthopedic Instrumentation Reprocessing in ASCs, sponsored by Heathmark. I'm Giles Bruce, a writer-reporter with Becker's ASC Review. Before we begin, I'm going to walk through a few quick housekeeping instructions. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation, and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into the Q&A box you see on your screen. We look forward to hearing your questions. Today's session is being recorded and will be available after the event. You can use the same link you used to log into today's webinar to access that recording. And if at any time you don't see your slides moving or have trouble with the audio, try refreshing your browser. You can also submit any technical questions into the Q&A box. We are here to help. Today we are joined by Adam Okada, a clinical education specialist with Heathmark Industries. Adam has 16 years of experience in sterile processing and is passionate about helping improve the quality of patient care by giving SPT technicians and their OR partners greater access to education and information. He has worked in just about every position in the sterile processing department as a case cart builder, SPT Tech 1, 2, and 3, lead tech, tracking system analyst, supervisor of both SPD and HLD, manager, and now he's an educator. Adam is the owner of Sterile Education, the world's first mobile application dedicated to sterile processing education, and a former clinical manager at Beyond Clean. He has published articles for HSPA's Process Magazine, is voting member of AAMI, and also serves as the current president for the Central California chapter of HPSA. Adam is currently a clinical education specialist at Heathmark Industries, where he works on Heathmark webinars and hybrid events, educational videos, as well as the Ask the Educator podcast with Kevin Anderson. Thank you so much for joining us, Adam. And at this time, I'm pleased to turn the floor over to Adam to begin his presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Giles. Appreciate the introduction, and I am super excited to be here. For a long time, I have been an attendee of Becker's webinars, so it's very cool to be on this end of it for once. And it's my first time presenting for Becker's, so again, a huge opportunity. Thank you to everybody at Becker's for giving me the opportunity. Thank you to Heathmark for sponsoring this event. Today we are going to be talking about orthopedic instrumentation reprocessing in the ambulatory surgery center setting, which is one of the huge challenges we have in the ASC. My very first consulting job was actually at an orthopedic-specific ASC. And so there was a lot of lessons learned through that. I've been to several of them in the meantime, and it's just a unique challenge in a unique setting. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Again, thank you, Giles, for the introduction. I am Adam Okada, Heathmark Industries Clinical Education Specialist. If I do have any views or opinions expressed in this presentation, those are my own, do not necessarily reflect that of Heathmark Industries. So some objectives for today's session. We're going to discuss the current state of ASCs and how we're handling orthopedic instrumentation. We're also going to review best practice standards and guidelines, and we'll go through a lot of the steps in the process as just a very overview, kind of this is the step, and then this is the best practice for that step. But we're also going to be in this section looking at some problem areas for instruments that are just really difficult to clean and pose a specific risk to patients because of their complexity or because of their reprocessing challenges in the ASC. And then we're also going to examine possible solutions and tools for dealing just with the complexity of the orthopedic instrumentation. So hopefully we'll give you some solutions and some things that you can use to take away that we can actually improve what we're doing in the ASC setting for these orthopedic instruments. And the good old days, when we had instruments that were typically one piece of stainless steel or two pieces of stainless steel, and they kind of behaved in very predictable ways. We knew where to look for the soil because it was usually at the same end of the instrument. We knew where the problem areas were on most instruments. We know the box locks are problems, anywhere where there's a hinge or an opening. But typically, we had a lot of stainless steel instrumentation, and it was relatively easy to clean. Now, fast forward to, since 1970, and a lot of change has taken place within the industry. Nowadays, we have long, narrow lumens, and lumens were always a problem because we couldn't see inside of them. But specifically with these long, narrow lumens, they've become a real issue in the industry. Tiny, tiny serrations on things. You can see there the reamers on the screen. There's a lot of things like that where the more ridges, serrations, openings you have, that's where bioburden is going to try to find. It likes to find dark, damp places. Anywhere it can hide out, that's where it's going to hide out. We also have like multi-part instruments, and again, in the old days, if we had multi-part instruments, it was very predictable how they would come apart. Nowadays, with a lot of these, and specifically with orthopedics, we have instrumentation that sometimes will slide back and forth, but doesn't necessarily come apart. It may have a lumen, but you may not be able to get a brush inside the lumen. And then there's other things like flexible reamers and things like that with multiple parts that are just, it's difficult, and you don't always know what parts come apart. As a technician myself, orthopedics were always the thing I would request. If our manager ever came to us and said, what kind of education do you guys want? I would always say orthopedics, because I needed to know which one of these things come apart, which ones don't, and just knowing what to look for when we're dealing with this complex instrumentation. There's also various metals and various plastics involved in the processing of these things, and minimally invasive surgery is now the norm. It's not the exception. Minimally invasive surgery is great for patients. We know that. It's great for their shorter hospital stays, to get them in and out of the facility. It's a lessened risk for infections, things like that. But with minimally invasive surgery, you have to understand these are longer instruments that are now going into a smaller hole, and the complexity of them just increases. So with this more complex instrumentation came very complex reprocessing instructions. And as we know from manufacturers, the manufacturing instructions are not always clear about how to take these things apart, how they're cleaned effectively. There may be tips and tricks, but they don't always put those in the IFU specifically. So we have to think about all of these things when we're in the department. This job is incredibly complex, and over the years, it's just gotten more and more difficult to do the job well. So that brings us to our current state of how we're doing things today. And when I think of a sterile processing department, this is usually what I think of. I grew up in the large hospital systems where we had just so much space. We had all these kinds of instrument sets all over the place, and washers unloading, washer racks, tables all over. You have banks of sterilizers, and some of the hospitals I worked at actually had like the pass-through sterilizers where you had one side where you'd put in the rack, and then the sterilizers would take it out to the other side, which was really cool. And washers, I mean, just a ton of washers, get a lot of space at the 3-bay sink, countertops, ultrasonics that can fit everything in them. And so while this is something that I would picture if you're talking about a sterile processing department, the reality in the ASC setting is that we are cramped and often in a one-room design with sinks that are way too small to do the instruments that we need to do. I'm going to tell this story really briefly, and then I want to come back to it at the end when we're coming back to solutions. But my first consulting job at an ASC was for an orthopedic ASC. And they had, it was a 72 square foot footprint. So that was the square footage of sterile processing, was 72 square feet. It had the world's smallest sink. I've never actually seen a sink in any setting that was smaller than this. The opening of the sink was only about 8 inches. It was 8 by 8. It was a square, and it was about 3 feet deep. So you could still soak things, but it was so small that you would have to get one arm in and like clean to get under the water line. You had to fill it all the way up to get the water line up to where it was reasonable. I've never seen a sink like that. And I think it was because of these space constraints. They said, well, what's the smallest sink we could possibly put in sterile processing? Which, by the way, if you're building a sterile processing, that's not the question you want to be asking. What's the smallest thing we can fit in here? And this was orthopedic-specific ASC. So just the world's smallest sink. It had countertops that were about 12 inches in width that went kind of around a quarter of the room. I'm trying to like take you through the whole room. It had the sink in the corner. Right next to it was an ultrasonic, again, too small for the orthopedic instrumentation. It went around with countertops that were only about 12 inches in width. They did have cabinets underneath. And then it went to a steam sterilizer that was a tabletop steam sterilizer, and that was it. That was all they could possibly fit in the room. You could fit one person down the center, but when I came in to do consulting, the two of us could not pass each other in the walkways. So it was a very tight setup. And that's just what I see all too often in the ambulatory surgery center setting, is that we're seeing this one-room design. This would actually be a great design, one-room design. This is from the AMI ST79, but we don't even usually get this space. It's almost like we're an afterthought when they're building these things. And literally that space that I was talking about, that orthopedic ASC, was literally a storage closet. It was essentially going to be the EVS closet before they decided, hey, we need a sterile processing, and they put it inside the 72 square foot storage closet. So in the beginning, we really just don't think about sterile processing. It's usually an afterthought, and when we're planning these things, we usually think we're going to need less space than we do. For others, when others are planning to do construction, I always say double the amount of space you think you need, because even if you don't use that space at first, if your business is to grow and if you are to grow into that space, you're going to need double the equipment at some point. So don't just think how much can I fit in this little space. Think about needing a lot more space as we go forward. So typically when you're looking at instruments like this, some of these instruments are incredibly long, incredibly, they're not easy to fit inside of a sink. How do we fit that into a space like this? Some of these instruments just flat out are going to stick out of the sink because they cannot be completely submerged. But when you're looking at the IFUs of what it says, it'll say that it needs to be completely submerged in the water to get that enzymatic contact with all surfaces. And this is going to be a unique challenge for the ASC. We're going to get some solutions toward the end of the presentation about these types of things. But the same thing occurs in the ultrasonic. I've seen, I don't know how many ultrasonics that you have the orthopedic instrumentation, and then I look at their ultrasonic, and you can fit maybe a clamp in there, a couple clamps, something small, but definitely not anything big enough that you're going to actually see during orthopedic surgeries. And if you look at how bloody the instruments are there on the left-hand side, we actually have the same exact problems that sterile processings do in a larger hospital setting. We have the same challenges. We have the same blood, bioburden, all those things, biofilms, but we have probably 1/20th the amount of space, maybe even like 1/50th the amount of space they have in a larger facility. So the amount of space, the amount of resources, the amount of equipment, all those things are going to be challenges when we look at an ASC setting. From storage to the sterile loaners to decontamination at the sink, the space is impacting just about every phase of reprocessing of orthopedic instrumentation in the ASC, and I'm going to try to focus on that as we're going through this presentation, that, look, we just may not have the space for certain things that are best practice, but we're also going to do little tips and tricks along the way to hopefully help out with that as well. So let's look at the Joint Commission non-compliance rate by program. If you step back for a minute, this is the program from 2009 to 2016 for the frequently scored non-compliance standard of IC 020201 for infection control. And if you see those acronyms over there on the left-hand side, the AHC is for ambulatory healthcare. And at the time of publication, Joint Commission noted that the most vulnerable locations for lapses to be processing was the ambulatory care sites. So to this point, Joint Commission had found from 2013 to 16 that immediate threat to life declarations directly related to improperly sterilized or high-level disinfected equipment increased significantly. In 2016, 74% of all of these were related to improperly sterilized or high-level disinfected equipment. And you might say, well, since 2016, surely we have improved upon that number. But unfortunately, in recent years, what we're seeing, this is almost a year and a half after this study, and they're saying the same thing. Ambulatory care and office-based surgery centers are especially prone to risk. And as for the top 10 most challenging ambulatory care standards in 2019, that same IC 020201 was still at the top of the list. So the past several years has brought an increasing and more consistent tendency for these accreditation surveys to more than ever focus on device reprocessing. And we see this routinely reflected in successive accreditation surveys. They're always looking at our infection prevention and whether we're doing things in the reprocessing center correctly. So let's look at the top 2 requirements identified as most frequently by the Joint Commission as not compliant. You can see there the organization reduces the risk of infections associated with medical instruments, or medical equipment, devices, and supplies. And then number 2 is the organization implements infection prevention and control activities. Those are the top 2 most frequently cited, and they have to do with us in sterile processing more than anything else. And if you're looking at the scored noncompliance, again, 2016, 17, 18, 19, and 2020, all the same noncompliance. Those same 2 standards were coming up again and again in Joint Commission surveys. So this is an article from 2022 in March, and essentially what it's looking at here is this is a full year after the Joint Commission had returned to surveys after the pandemic. And as expected, the most high-risk findings at ASCs are related to infection control, medication management, and leadership, and the challenges actually mirrored those of 2019. So even though we've come back post-pandemic, the same exact challenges are going on again and again. We're still having issues with devices, with reprocessing, and making sure those things are safe for proper reuse. So in this section, what we're going to be looking at is examining industry best practice for each step in the orthopedic reprocessing cycle, from the point of use all the way back into sterile storage. And along the way, we're also going to be looking at our biggest troublemakers. That's the instruments and the equipment that are most often causing infection concerns with orthopedics. So let's look at the pre-cleaning step. We know how important that is, that decontamination really begins at the point of use in the operating room. It talks about the removal of gross soil, and there's been a lot of debate in the industry. What is gross soil? I'm hopefully going to show some pictures a little bit later on of gross soil and what that kind of means to me. I see it as anything large amounts that is visible on the instrumentation should be cleaned away. It doesn't mean you have to get every single spot of soil off. If there's a little streak or if there's a little spot left on there, that's what the pretreatment spray is for and things like that. But removal of gross soil is if you can see it on the instruments, and especially if there's a large amount of it, just wipe it off. And that's what that removal of gross soil is intended to mean. That's my interpretation of it. And then preparing those instruments for decontamination, keeping them moist. For us in sterile processing, our enemy is biofilm. And the biofilms start to form so quickly that it's really important for us to keep these instruments wet from the point of use all the way down to us in decontamination. And however we do that, through the sprays or humipacks or things like that, all of these are great ways of keeping it wet or moist for us so that we can then reprocess more effectively. And then we're looking at transportation from the OR to sterile processing, an often forgotten about step. Once instruments are pre-treated, they should be placed into containers that are labeled as biohazardous in some type of containment device. And the transportation of soiled items should prevent cross-contamination between the point of use and the decontamination area. So if you have a case cart, that's great. A latched cart labeled as biohazard is great. Having a container that's latched and labeled as biohazard is another way, especially in the ASC setting, to transport, especially if you're going any kind of distance between them. And the picture on the screen is exactly what we want to see in sterile processing. This is a perfectly, actually I'm being very sarcastic. When you're looking at the screen, this is exactly what we don't want to see. Instruments that are piled on top of each other, all haphazard kind of thrown in. I have no idea how that tray on the left is standing up and how those instruments are staying in there, but maybe the technician had some sort of telekinesis that he was able to hold these instruments from falling onto the floor. But all too often in sterile processing, what happens, we get into decontamination, we open the door to the cart, and things just fall out onto the floor, which is huge infection risks. That's not one of the goals of point-of-use transportation. We need to be protecting not only our coworkers, not only the staff that's walking through the hospital and the patients walking through the hospital, we also should be protecting our instrumentation. So there's a lot of damage that occurs from the point of use to the decontamination area, and we need to be aware of that to try to limit that as much as possible. There are four factors for effective manual cleaning at the sink. The first one is going to be the chemical, so the dilution of the chemical as well as the action, the cleaning action of the chemical. The soak time is important. Remember, it needs to contact all surfaces of it so that when you're going to clean it manually with the brushes, it's able to brush it off. The one thing that I think is interesting about decontamination is you really have to separate decontamination from disinfection and sterilization. Decontamination is about cleaning things off. There's no killing of microorganisms at this step. We're just trying to remove as many as possible. And then once they're not visible anymore, visible and non-visible, all that soil is just removed. That's when disinfection and sterilization can be effective because they don't do any cleaning. They have no cleaning action. Disinfectants and sterilants can disinfect the outsides and then whatever they can contact. But if you've got gross bioburden still on an instrument, disinfection and sterilization is not going to be effective. So you really need to do a good job of cleaning with the chemical, with the dilution action and soak time. You also need to think about the temperature. Remember that blood coagulates at 140 degrees. So it's important to have, like if you're doing a pre-soak, making sure that's in cool water. And then when it's in your first sink, doing your manual cleaning, make sure that's in the correct temperature range for the chemical so that soak time can work. And then the mechanical action, that's us actually at the sink cleaning off as much bioburden as we possibly can. That's where we use our tools like brushes, channel brushes, block brushes, all those kinds of things. And of course, again, an important note, just something I always like to put into every presentation about decontamination. Please clean underneath the water line. That is good practice. It is poor practice to lift it up above the sink, and you can see there the instrument's getting cleaned above the sink line. That also, by the way, I just want to point out that there's a tongue scraper on the back of that toothbrush thing, and that is not the right toothbrush for cleaning instrumentation. That very likely is a Walmart or Target purchase or dollar store purchase to save money for the facility. Anytime we see that, we always try to make sure, hey, it needs to be the correct instrumentation. The tools that we use are very, very important. So again, underneath the water line, making sure you have the correct tools. For our powered equipment, another one of these complex things that's come about, we do not submerge these unless it's specified in the manufacturer's IFU. So make sure you know what the IFU say about submerging powered equipment. Fluid invasion is one of the big problems with the decontamination equipment. And it really has to do with when you put something underneath the water and there's gallons of water pressure, that water pressure will cause that powered equipment to get fluid invaded. So make sure we're not submerging these, again, unless it's specified in the manufacturer IFU. And most IFUs for powered equipment specify multiple brushes that are used for various sizes of openings. If you look at their IFUs very carefully, it'll actually specify what kind of brush goes in specific openings. And you do also have to pay attention to any area where blood can go where you cannot see. And I'm going to give an example of that right here. So we see a chuck, very common thing that we very often see in the sterile processing decontamination area. And we ask the question, did you really clean this chuck? And if you look on the inside of it, you can tell that maybe not so well. You can see there's a lot of discoloration inside. These things where you have parts that are inside where you like twist it and then they come out, those are always problems because how do you clean all the various areas as those things are getting removed? Where the chuck is like coming out to grab the drill bit. Those are difficult areas for us to clean. We need the right kind of equipment. We need to make sure we're taking care and brushing it really, really effectively. And then checking it, making sure you can use inspection tools like microscopes. This is, again, you can see this with a microscope here. But having that lighted magnification or a boroscope is going to be huge about seeing this kind of discoloration or bioburden and making sure it gets cleaned away. Shavers. What can I say about shavers? I think it might be just easier to show you just a few of the problems that we're seeing with shavers all over the country. So on the left, you can see a shaver that's been taken apart, and it's hard to see on the screen. I apologize, the quality of the picture is not great, but there's a little crack at where the light blue arrow is. There's a crack in the shaft of the shaver where bioburden can get in, potential leak location. There's also one where the metal plate there is meeting kind of the plastic, the black plastic. There's a little gap there, and that's another location where water can get into if you're not paying attention and you don't see those things. And then on the right-hand picture, You can see there's that little gap there between where the piece meets the bottom. You can see a little black circle or half circle there. Those are all locations in a shaver where leaks can start occurring. So making sure you're leak testing your shavers, a lot of people have no idea that they should be doing that. It is usually something that is a step that's needed. And then making sure that any type of area where there could be a leak, that's usually where you're also going to find bioburden as well. And so we're just going to give some examples. All of these have been taken with a boroscope, and you can see the various degree of bioburden, discoloration, rusting, other types of things that have occurred inside of these shavers. If there's rusting occurring, it's very likely because there was blood left in there at some point that just started to eat away at the stainless steel. And now as we got, you can see pitting, you can see discoloration coming out. This, I have no idea what this is. This is absolutely disgusting. And you may think, well, this is probably after the case and you took a picture of it. I want to point out, this picture was taken with a boroscope after all of the cleaning steps were completed. So the cleaning steps were completed as in the IFU, and this picture through the boroscope was put in there. I have no idea what it is, how it got left, but this is the problem with these shavers, is unless you have the equipment to look inside and verify these things are clean, I can show you a shaver from the outside, and we can take a 70-30% that it might be good, 50-50. We have no idea. Unless we can look inside, we have no idea what's going on in there. One of my personal least favorite instruments to clean was always the kerosene rongers. They're frustrating, and maybe most frustrating and difficult to clean of the ortho or neuro type of instrumentation. And this is because of the way that the gap is in the kerosene and how these close up. It's just very difficult for us to get inside with brushes. We really need to rely on our automated equipment, like our ultrasonics, things like that, to help us with these difficult to reach places. Anywhere where you have a gap where bioburden can get in, but it's difficult for us to get brushes into that same area to clean. And we're going to see this repeated through a few of these problem instrumentation things. Kerosenes, I think, are one of the huge ones. One of the big advantages, though, is we do have take-apart kerosenes now. Take-apart kerosenes do provide a better cleaning for us in sterile processing. I know that I've worked with surgeons that hated them, and they don't hold tension as well. But honestly, if you had the choice between a dirty or I don't know what's inside kerosene or one that you absolutely could take apart and look at and show was clean, my vote would always be the clean one and the one that's going to be the safest for the patient. So just something to keep in mind when you're talking about kerosenes is to look at these and try to think what is the risk and what is the benefit of using, say, a take-apart to fix one of these problems. So this one is a biotenodesis driver. You're able to clean the center part by putting a brush down that center cannula. That's great. That's a relatively easy place to clean, although the cannula is that small. It's difficult to know what's going on inside. But this driver moves up and down to a set point, but it doesn't come all the way out. So you're unable to really get in between, and especially that arrow at the bottom there where it's pointing at the circle, that little space right there is going to be a specific problem for biotenodesis drivers because you're really unable to clean between the inner and the outer shaft. So debris will get trapped in there, and it's really not seen until it's overclogged, until that stuff is so filled with bioburden that then it starts coming out kind of like a sink drain where it's backed up all the way from the bottom, and then it's not till you see it coming out of the sink, into the sink, that you realize that it's a problem. So biotenodesis drivers, I always think of, are a huge problem. Look at the gross debris coming out of these things. If you do have biotenodesis drivers, do your best, absolutely, to make sure you're brushing effectively at the sink. Soak time is good, making sure all those things stay moist from point of use all the way to SPD. And then your ultrasonic is your friend with these instruments. Again, follow the IFUs. Beyond anything I say in this presentation, make sure you always refer to the instructions for use as well. But you can see these are a major problem. Anything that doesn't quite come apart, like a kerosene or a biotenodesis driver, is going to be a specific issue of concern for reprocessing. So that instrument that's being pointed to right there, that drill guide, that is the number one. Anytime I audit a hospital, if I see this set, I will always grab this set, and I will always look at this instrument first. That drill guide is used for nearly every small frag. I believe it's used on every small frag. Somebody may be able to correct me and say, well, not every single case uses it. I think it's used on just about every single one. Because of how it's used, there will almost always be blood inside, and this drill guide is one of the most common mistakes with orthopedic instrumentation because people don't take it apart. They assume if it's soaking at the sink, and they assume if they brush the outside of it or they brush through that little lumen, that it'll be good. But if you take apart that drill guide on the right-hand side that's got a screw top, there's a spring and there's a second lumen in there. So again, you can't just put a brush through it and assume it's good. You have to take it apart, put brushes through all the pieces of it, and then clean it all separate. And in sterile processing, this is just one of those things that's very time-consuming. And whenever I audit this set, I would say at least 50% of the time, that drill guide has either fresh bioburden or cooked on bioburden where I can tell it has not been cleaned effectively. And that's not a joke, 50%. In my old hospital, it was worse than that. So trust me, in the field, it's getting a little bit better. At my original facility where I started doing audits, it was pretty bad. It was about 75% that people were not cleaning these. So it's a huge issue. Please, please, please clean the drill guides effectively. So remember I was talking about gross soil at the point of use? It's one of those things where you know it if you see it, and if you see that picture, you know that's what gross soil is. Not only because it's disgusting and gross, just the amount of soil, you can visibly see that there's too much there. It's not going to be easy for us to clean an SPD. And acetabular reamers really pose a massive risk for us because they're rarely cleaned at the point of use. This is one of those things I think they just don't know how to clean, or they can't get in there to clean with any tools in the OR, so they just kind of leave them like this. And they often come to decontamination just dried and really difficult to get them out. Very specifically difficult to clean with our type of brushes. Just know that there are acetabular type brushes that will help with this kind of thing. Make sure you research and find those types of brushes and give that tool to your sterile processing technicians. If they're using a block brush and trying to get all around the nooks and crannies and all around like the right angle inside of the acetabular reamers, there's just no brush, a block style brush that can do that. So you need specialty acetabular brushes to help you with these types of things. So I know I tell a lot of stories when I give presentations, and the flexible reamer is a story that I tell because I honestly had one I could never get clean. I had to throw it away. So I'll tell the story. So I was on the night shift, and we were a 24-hour facility. We did an emergency case overnight, and we had these flexible reamers come down. I actually think they were there before I got there. So they'd come down on the PM shift, and PMs couldn't figure out how to clean them, so they left them for me. I was by myself overnight, and I sat in decontamination, I'm not kidding, for about 4 hours, sitting there with this flexible reamer, cleaning it at the sink, ultrasonicking it, tapping it on a white towel, and that white towel turning pink. And then I'd get frustrated, and I'd say, okay, I'm going to go back to the sink, I'm going to clean it more effectively, I'm going to soak it, I'm going to make sure I'm cleaning, and I'm bending the flexible reamer as I'm cleaning it and getting in all the little ridges, and like every single ridge I made sure I was trying to clean. I had a little fine brush end that I was using to try to get in there, put it in the ultrasonic, it came out, tap it, it's pink. And I gave up after 4 hours because I felt like other things needed to happen during the night. I needed to do testing, I needed to get trays ready for the morning. I couldn't just sit there and focus on a flexible reamer all night long. But I remember that being one of the most frustrating experiences of my career. And it's just a really good reminder that as we get more complex in our instrumentation, the cleaning becomes infinitely more complex. And that's how we see increases in infections. The more complex you make it, the more difficult it is to be able to get all of the bioburden out. Same is true of any type of, anywhere where there's serrations, ridges, where there's a lot of blood, or over there on the right-hand side. You can see all the little nooks and crannies where bioburden, blood, soil, cement, all of these things can get into, and then makes it very, very difficult for us to clean in sterile processing. So examine your instrumentation. Anytime you see a difficult to clean item, that's what you need to focus on in decontamination. The basic items should be, I'm not saying don't take the time to clean them effectively. You definitely want to clean them effectively. But because of their straightforward design, it's going to be a little bit easier to clean those and move on to the next one. These are the types of things that we really need to spend a lot of time with. And again, gross soil, you know it if you see it. The one on the left, definitely gross soil, needs to be wiped off at the point of use. For your ultrasonic, you really need to make sure your ultrasonic is large enough to submerge everything underneath the water line. Cavitation action is really weakened if the chamber is overloaded or if there's bioburden on the instrumentation. So you do need to think about that. Do not put things in the ultrasonic that are grossly soiled. I used to have a facility that I worked at where they thought the ultrasonic was the first step. So they would take the bloody instrumentation, put it in the ultrasonic and run it. And then, oh, it's cleaner for us to go to the sink now. It was cleaner. They're also destroying the ultrasonic, and cavitation is not really working effectively. It's not able to contact all the surfaces. So we clean at the sink first, then we move to the cavitation action of the ultrasonic. Remember how the ultrasonic works on cavitation. It's going into hard-to-reach places, all those little crevices where you clean off the outside, and then now the ultrasonic can get into the hard-to-reach places and pull some of those things out. When those bubbles implode, it's going to pull out the bubble, or it's going to pull out the soil from those hard-to-reach places. So the ultrasonic's a great tool, but you do have to use it in the right way. Per EME ST79 Annex D, please make sure that you are testing your ultrasonic effectively. Your ultrasonic requires 2 tests for each day that it's in use. You need a soil removal test. You also need a test for cavitation. So those are 2 different things. You can have cavitation, but it's not removing soil, and you can have a soil removal, then cavitation is not working. So those are the 2 tests you need for each ultrasonic, and if you have an irrigating ultrasonic, please keep in mind that you need 3 tests: the soil removal, a test for cavitation, and you also need to test for soil removal through lumens. That lumen flushing, you need to be able to test to make sure it's removing the soil through that lumen flushing. So just important things to keep in mind. A lot of smaller departments that I see don't realize this or forget that there is a testing requirement for most of their equipment, and it's just, you do need to do these tests to make sure your equipment is functioning properly. So next, let's look at the automated washer. Remember, automated washers work on the principle of impingement. So any instrument that's buried underneath layers and layers of other instruments that won't get that impingement, they may not get cleaned appropriately. You need to make sure that the chemical and the impingement contact are there so that the instruments can get cleaned. What I see a lot of times is for loaner sets, they'll leave the tray lids on top. And I understand it for like implant trays, things like that. But most of the loaner trays that I see go with the lids on through the automated washer. The impingement will work on anything that can get through those little tiny holes on the top. But anything where it's hitting the lid and not hitting the instruments underneath, none of that is going to get cleaned effectively. So you have to make sure that the impingement can work. That spray force has to be able to hit all surfaces of the inside of the tray. If you have a multi-layer tray, you need to take those trays apart. And this is often spelled out in the instructions for use. They'll actually say, if you have multi-levels, you need to split the levels up onto different racks to make sure that impingement or the automated washer disinfection can work on all surfaces inside. So just something to keep in mind with the automated washer. Impingement, contact, really, really vital. For the lubrication step, it's a little bit complex. I don't want to go ahead and say that nothing in the orthopedics can go through the ultrasonic or the lubrication cycle. What I do want to say is there are some orthopedic trays, powered equipment implant trays, that may not be able to go through the lubrication cycle. So please look at your instructions for use on the use of lubrication cycle for automated washers. I took the IFU from one of the most common orthopedic vendors, one of their implant trays, and I looked at their instructions for use through the automated washer, and it actually set the cycle where it would say warm-up cycle, pre-rinse, first detergent flush, all these things were in the instructions. It laid out every step, but it did not have a lubrication step. There was nothing listed there. And it didn't have anything below the table of the steps that said, here's how you do lubrication. So I called the vendor, and essentially what they explained to me is, look, if it's not in the instructions, it's not something you should be doing. So if you have a lubrication step on your automated washer and you're putting everything through that, you need to examine, if you have orthopedic trays, whether or not that's going to be appropriate. If the IFU doesn't state that it's okay, you probably shouldn't be doing it. So we've gotten through decontamination. We're now on the inspection and assembly side, where we always need to test our instruments for functionality. In the prep and pack, they need to be tested for cleanliness, but they also need to be tested to make sure they're functioning correctly. And the reason is because this is the last time that eyes are going to be on the instrument before it's actually opened in the operating room. When the surgeon gets handed an instrument that does not function appropriately, I can guarantee you they are not happy. They want things that function, and so that's our job in sterile processing is, yes, we need to look for cleanliness. Absolutely, we inspect it, but we also need to be testing it for functionality. And to do that, again, we need the proper tools. We need the things at our disposal that we can use to help us make sure our instruments are good to go. Anything with a insulation and the new amendments to AMI ST 79, when we're talking about the amendments in 2000, I believe it was 2019, 2020, I'm not exactly sure when it was done, but they created this new set of amendments where it was basically one of those amendments had to do with inspection of insulated instruments. If you have an insulated instrument, regardless of what type it is, laparoscopic, ortho, wherever you're using it, bipolar forceps are very common in just about every service line. So anytime you have insulation, it has to be tested. Same thing with our cameras and our scopes. We have tools that we can use to actually look through those scopes and make sure that they're working effectively before they get to the OR. And lighted magnification. I cannot stress the importance of lighted magnification. My eyes used to be great. I used to have pilot vision, but even at 2010, when my vision was that good, it's terrible now because I'm old, but when it was good, I still couldn't see some of the microscopic cracks and things like that chuck that we looked at earlier. That's under magnification. I couldn't necessarily see those types of things with my bare naked eye. So lighted magnification is huge. We need those tools. Even in the ambulatory surgery setting where space is an issue, we still need to have the tools to inspect them correctly so we know that they're good for patients. So for sterilization, we're just going to go through this pretty briefly. Steam sterilization really can only be effective if steam can contact the surfaces of all the instrumentation inside of the package. Same thing for low temperature sterilization, by the way. That low temperature sterilant needs to be able to contact everything inside the package. So don't overload the packages. I see a lot of small orthopedic trays packed with dense metal. Anytime you do that, you stack that metal on top of it, it's going to be less effective. When it's in the sterilizer, contact for all surfaces isn't going to be as effective. You also don't want to overload the sterilizer itself. If you have a small, like an ASC setting, a small sterilizer off to the side of the room or on a tabletop, those often have a weight limit. And if you have a weight limit, orthopedic trays are often 20, 25 pounds. You put 2 of them in there, now you've got 50. I know some of those small tabletop sterilizers will have a weight limit of 20 pounds or 25 pounds for a cycle. So you look at your IFUs for your sterilizer itself and make sure that you can actually process everything that you need to be able to process. The event-related sterility is often misunderstood. Some interpret event-related to mean, well, it can stay on the shelf forever. Real quickly, I had an experience where I was on the night shift and I was tasked to clean off a shelf that they felt like had not been cleaned in a long time. So I went on top of this shelf and I saw a blue-wrapped instrument. I believe it was a laparoscopic grasper. And I went onto the top shelf and I pulled it down. And as I was pulling it down, it was a rain of blue powder that just went poof into the air and just started raining down on me very, very slowly. It just was blue powder all over me and all over the floor, all over everything. And what had happened over time was that blue wrap was up there, and as air and dust circulates and things like that, it would settle on it and then the air would move. It broke down the blue wrap to the point where it was just dust. Now, event-related people that think, oh, that can stay on the shelf forever would say, well, that's still sterile in there. But the wrap itself fell apart as soon as you touched it. So you need to look at your peel pouch, your wrap, your rigid container IFUs, and look at shelf life or expiration dates for some of these items. If there is an expiration date on it, that's an event that can cause the item to become unsterile. So look at those dates, pay attention to them, and make sure if you see something like this on your package, maximum shelf life of 5 years, whatever it is, some are as short as 6 months. So you really need to check your IFUs for your peel pouches, wraps, and rigid container filters. look at all that stuff and look at, remember, those are events as well that can cause an item to not be sterile any longer. For the area of sterile storage, there's a lot of area requirements as well. You need to store items at least 8 inches off the floor. Make sure that bottom shelf has a solid bottom. And then for the top, make sure the top of the top package in the room is at least 18 inches below the bottom of the sprinkler head. A lot of ASCs I see pile that stuff all the way to the ceiling. I take pictures of their sprinkler head and the items that are sitting on the shelf right next to them and show them that this is not just me recommending this. This is often an OSHA or a fire code safety violation. So you do need to make sure that those things are in place, even in a smaller setting where space is an issue. For temperature, air, humidity, and air exchange requirements, those are set by whatever the ASHRAE 170 standards were when the building was constructed. So make sure you know those standards, you keep those standards, and make sure you're always recording the temperature and humidity daily. The other thing I'll remind you of is, even though you're monitoring temperature and humidity daily, the other thing you need to be able to do is, if it falls out of compliance, you need to be able to explain the process for what happens in that case. Sometimes I'll go into a facility and I'll see that their temperature is high. They've set a range of 68 to 73 or 72 to 78, and then I'll see a 79 or an 80 pop up on the chart. And I say, well, what do you do when it pops up over 80? And they say, nothing. It just means it was high that day. And that's not what they want to see. They want to make sure that if it falls out of alignment, that you have a plan in place for what you do in that case, especially because a lot of the packaging requirements for sterile storage do require a certain temperature and humidity level. So one of the things we see quite often looking at shelving and things on the shelf is we'll see things hanging off of the shelf line. As you walk past these, they very often get brushed or nicked. It's so easy to put a hole in one of these wraps. So please be aware of that as you're walking through walkways. Make sure if you have a very deep tray, this is especially in an orthopedic setting is true, you have very long, deep trays. Make sure they're all the way back against the, as far back as they can be pushed, and make sure they don't hang over the edge, because if we're talking about event-related sterility, knocking into them with a case cart is a very easy way to make that tray unsterile, because you'll have holes in them. For those holes and wraps, again, there's not a lot we can do about it on the sterile processing side, but this is often just a forgotten about step in storage. We need to maintain the sterility from where we are all the way until it's going to be used on another patient. So just be aware of holes and wraps, keeping things on the shelf and making sure they're against the shelf line, not having them hang off the end like that. So we've talked about a lot of issues and a lot of potential problems and a little bit about some of the best practice of the industry, but now we're going to look at some possible solutions that we can use to help us improve some of those things we saw early on. We want to improve upon those numbers from the Joint Commission. We don't want to see all these infections. So these are some things that we can do. The first one I think is really important is inspection tools. So one of the best ways for us to improve quickly is we need to give sterile processing staff the proper tools to inspect for cleanliness as well as functionality. And the reason is because it's almost impossible to clean what you cannot see. So lighted magnification, microscopes, boroscopes, all of those things are really essential tools in the modern day fight against bioburden. When it was stainless steel instrumentation, 1 to 2 pieces, relatively simple construction, you still needed that lighted magnification because there are hairline cracks and things that you can't see with the naked eye. But nowadays, with so many complex instruments, it's really just not acceptable to not have lighted magnification microscopes and boroscopes. And I mean, just think about all of the things that we see. Not just me, go to any presentation that talks about boroscopes and look at what the findings are from when they put boroscopes inside of things. Every single time it's terrifying. Every single time we look at an instrument with a boroscope, there's like a little part of me that's like, I wonder what I'm going to see. I wonder what new thing I'm going to find, what new creature or what new kind of weird bioburden is inside of this. And it shouldn't be that way. We should have these tools at our disposal, even in smaller settings. We're going to talk a little bit about the space issue, but even in a smaller setting, we need to have the tools to make sure we can see these things. One thing that's been effective for me at smaller facilities is the idea of this procedure tray. So creating basic orthopedic trays with the most common instrumentation having a few more of those sets available so that we can do fewer turnovers, making sure we have enough instruments to get through an entire day with our basic orthopedic trays. And then we create surgeon-specific or smaller content-specific trays, which are smaller and easier to duplicate. Instead of just spending tons and tons of money creating one new gigantic ortho tray, why not create 2 or 3 smaller trays and then 2 or 3 small surgeon-specific trays for the same cost? And that way you have the instruments to do 3 procedures instead of just 1 more. So it's a mistake I see sometimes is I'll see these huge, huge trays, but not the specific instrumentation from procedure trays. That is one thing we can do to hopefully help fewer turnovers and hopefully help the sterile processing to take as much time as they need to get the instrumentation done. Another solution is data and analytics. Even if you don't have the electronic tracking system in place, you can still create basic timings of how long certain tasks take in your surgery center. I was at a specific or at a community hospital where it was very similar to an ASC, maybe a little bit larger than your average one, but we had essentially a very small department. And one of the things we didn't have was the tracking system. There was no tracking system in place, but I needed to show that we were not adequately staffed to process the number of loaner trays that we were getting in. So essentially what I did is I had them track from check-in, how long does check-in take, how long does it take to decontaminate them, how long does it take to prep them in the prep side, how long does it take to essentially sterilize them, pull them out, cool them, all these things, how much manpower hours were needed to process 1 loaner or 1 set of loaner trays. And it ended up being quite a bit, and we really were able to show the amount of time it took to do these loaners, how many were coming in per day, and the fact that we needed and we were able to justify more staffing. So those data and analytics can really help you with staffing problems, and it can also help you understand how long is spent on turnovers, things like that, so that way you can effectively plan for the future events and then eliminate any kind of redundancy and waste in your processes just by using small things like timings, data and analytics. If you have electronic tracking, that's perfect. Please use it. You get those reports and use it to really drive improvement in your department. We also really want to be proactive about quality. So we want to make sure there's a quality assurance policy or procedures in place for our facilities. We need to highlight the problem trays or any kind of complex instrumentation. Any of those instruments I showed you earlier, those are usually the problem areas that you want to highlight. That drill guide, I promise you, is one of the biggest issues I've seen everywhere I've gone. And then even when you do this quality program and you get it in place, make sure that you revisit the issues and mistakes. And when there's a positive audit, make sure you highlight that as well. Yes, you want to let somebody know if they made a mistake and just very calmly explain, I did a QA audit on your tray, here was the issue I saw. But you also want to make sure that you're highlighting, hey, when you did this, I did your tray today, and it was 100% perfect. That is exactly what we want to see. We want to make sure we're highlighting positives. Quality programs don't always have to be just finding problems, reporting problems. If staff sees that and hears that, they get very negative about the program very quickly. So make sure you highlight the positives as well. For instructions for use, you definitely need to make sure you have up-to-date instructions for use on everything that you have inside the facility. Your vendor partners are your allies in this. So constant education and training from vendors, especially when it comes to orthopedic trays. That was always the thing I requested, was I wanted my ortho vendors to come in, show me how to clean the biotenodesis driver. Show me how you are supposed to clean it according to the IFUs that's going to get this bioburden out. And when you do that, you can learn things. You pick up new things from the vendors that they say, hey, look, I get it. It's a hard to clean instrument. Here's what we do to make sure it's limited to as little bioburden in there as possible. All of those things are hugely helpful, but having those instructions for use on hand is absolutely vital for every single thing that you're going to clean. Space. So I promised you earlier on, this is the story I told about the ASC with the 72 square feet. They were performing really nothing but large orthopedic procedures, primarily total knees, total hips, with this tiny, tiny thing, department and tiny sink that I've never seen. 8 inches square was just bananas. So unfortunately, I don't have a great way to maximize that current space. What I told them is, look, you need a bigger space to do these things. We have to have a bigger footprint. We need a full-size sink to submerge all these instruments at the sink. We need a regular-size ultrasonic to be able to have these longer instruments submerged and then ultrasonic because of all the nooks and crannies inside. Some of their IFUs actually required the ultrasonic step. It was actually in the IFU. So not following it, not putting them in that tiny, tiny ultrasonic was not following the instructions for use. In the interim, what we did is we found space-saving solutions. So at the sink, what we did is we had like a tub that sat on top of the sink. We marked the gallon lines and things like that. So they were able to actually submerge those things on a temporary basis in a temporary type of decontamination container. Is it ideal? No, absolutely not. But it was the interim solution we had to a really bad space problem. In the long term, the construction that they ended up doing at that facility, on the opposite side of sterile processing was an old Steris 1E machine that was no longer in use. It just sat there, and it was still hooked up to the water and everything, and it was just sort of sitting there taking up space. So I said, look, if you're not using this machine, let's put this into storage, put it into another location. If you ever need it back, you can always bring it back. But let's take this area behind sterile processing and let's move out like 6 to 8 feet. And by doing that, you can create a bigger space, a full-size sink that you can soak things in, a full-size ultrasonic. They already had the washer there, but you could actually do a pass-through washer instead of a one-sided washer. There was a lot of things that they were able to do in the reconstruction, and all we did was move one machine and some storage things that really didn't need to be in the hallway. We just moved them out, and we created 8 extra feet of sterile processing where they had a bigger department. I wish I had the before and after pictures. I never took like a full, I looked in my picture folder. I never took a full picture of what it was before and a full picture of how it looked after. But it is an incredible difference just having a little bit extra space, 8 feet more of space. They were able to completely change their processes around. So another potential solution, I know we're kind of running out of time here, is to gain perspective. I always recommend that OR and SPD, even in a smaller setting, walk a while in each other's shoes, have reprocessing staff observe cases, go through that experience, tour the SPD, have the OR staff tour SPD, and work a day there to understand the challenges. For the staff that goes back and forth and does both, that's perfect because they usually understand the challenges of each area and then can usually help out. That's where you see really good pre-cleaning, by the way, is when you need to go and clean them at the decontamination sink. That's when we see really good point of use cleaning. The last thing I'm going to say here is about education. So please support certification for reprocessing staff. Staff needs to understand their enemy, the pathogens, microorganisms, and they also need to understand the tools that are at their disposal, the chemistries we use to clean, disinfection, sterilization theory and how it works. And the more they're able to understand, the better equipped they are to fight their enemy, the pathogens and the microorganisms. You may have heard that quote from Sun Tzu, know thy enemy, but the full quote actually reads, if you know the enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. And if you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. And the way I think about that in sterile processing is, if we understand what we're fighting against, pathogens, the microorganisms, the chain of infection, all of those things, and we understand our equipment and our tools, the things that we use to protect ourselves, how we follow those IFUs, and how important it is to follow them each and every time, then we use the tools at our disposal to vanquish our enemy. And again, if we know the enemy and we know ourselves, that's when we come out successful. So in conclusion here, orthopedic trays, large, complex, include some of the most difficult to clean instrumentation we encounter. But with tools like creative problem solving, space optimization, data-driven decision-making, as well as a dedication to education and quality, we can really make a positive difference in our orthopedic processes. Thank you guys. Here's my contact information on the screen. And then, Giles, I'll welcome you back if we have any questions that we can get to. I know we've only got about a minute left here.
Okay, thank you, Adam, for the great presentation. Let me get to a couple of quick questions here. One from Danielle, is there a medical grade boroscope that you would recommend?
I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about products here, but I will say the Heathmark, the Fizz 007 is my personal favorite because it's got, it's kind of convertible. You can have different sizes of the boroscopes. It actually, I think, goes down to like a 1.0 something. millimeter width, so we can get in really, really tight spaces. So the Heathmark Fizz, that would be my recommendation. Hopefully Heathmark will give me a little kickback if we see an increase in sales in that.
Okay. And a question from Julie. What do you recommend to help get buy-in from the OR to perform point-of-use cleaning?
Definitely show them the pictures of what biofilm is and how it forms and the infection risks associated with them. I often think that they think it's just to make things easier for us in sterile processing, that we're asking them to do our jobs for us. And it's not about that. And it's not as difficult as sometimes it can seem. Usually just wiping off the gross soil, the large amounts, and then leave the smaller stuff to us. We'll take care of the little things, the little streaks, the little tiny spots. But if you wipe it at the point of use, that's huge for preventing that bioburden that starts to build underneath those colonies of organisms. When they start forming, it becomes almost impossible to remove. So that would be definitely something I would suggest, is to help them understand why. It's not because it makes it easier for us.
Okay, great. And so, yeah, that is all the time we have for today. I want to thank Adam for his insights and Heathmark for sponsoring today's webinar. And thank you to our attendees for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to having you join us for future webinars.
Thank you, everyone.